Good evening. This is MAE Brussell. The title of this one-hour broadcast is World Watchers. It is program number 778, November the 3rd, 1986. I will begin the program by mentioning two documents that are locked up in the National Archives that pertain to what Jack Ruby was trying to say at his trial. He was tried for killing Lee Harvey Oswald, and for all we know, these commission documents are still not available. One is titled Fascists and Nazis Today by Albin Michael from Paris. It is labeled document number 1093. The other, that I can't pronounce so well, is called the Bundanachrichtendienst file, whatever that means, document 597. Now, Jack Ruby smuggled letters out of the jail, and he spoke at his trial that Nazis and fascists were behind the Kennedy murder. And to hear the Warren Report talk about his paranoia, they didn't use those words. Jack Ruby at his trial said Nazis and fascists killed John Kennedy. And Ruby, according to one archive statement or document, said was more knowledgeable about the conspiracy than most. And most people don't refer to a conspiracy in Dallas. A few people do, but Ruby was more knowledgeable. Now, at the time of Ruby's trial that took place September 9th, 1965, a Judge Lewis Holland had persons surrounding Jack Ruby, trying to stop him from giving his opinion about the Kennedy assassination. And according to one document, Ruby disregarded his lawyers who were telling him to be quiet. And he said there was a conspiracy in high places behind the Kennedy assassination. Various news reports related, he said people in high places suppressed information about Oswald, and that he knew, and as he said, this microphones were pushed away from his face, and he objected. He said, the world has a right to hear the truth, that Oswald knew Kennedy was coming to Dallas even before Kennedy knew it, and that newsmen should search in high sources of political government to find out how Oswald got the job at the depository on the motorcade route. Now, the week of November 22nd, the 22nd anniversary of the murder of John Kennedy, there's going to be a three-part television series put on by Vincent Bugliosi, the famous prosecutor of the Manson trial, and an attorney representing the interests of Lee Oswald, who believes Oswald was guilty, even though he's representing him. But one of the real live witnesses out of all this fiction is going to be Ruth Paine, the lady who got Oswald the job at the Texas School Depository. And Ruth Paine's husband worked for Walter Dornberger, that famous Nazi war criminal who, according to the author of Project Paperclip, found documents that the British wanted to hang him at Nuremberg, that he would be a threat to world peace and to, helping stir up a World War III type of activity. Michael Paine was a third-generation Harvard physicist who worked for Dornberger. Oswald stayed at their home. So in a few weeks you will see the real Ruth Paine, and I'll do more about her later. But Jack Ruby said, go into this matter and look into these people because Nazis and fascists were behind the Kennedy murder. And as I say, two books on Nazis and fascism linked to Jack Ruby are locked up in the National Archives. Larry King had Lyndon LaRouche on the air this week on TV, and I called into the program. Some of you might have heard it, recognized the Carmel in my voice, and I asked Lyndon LaRouche why he publishes so much investigative work of a fairly high caliber and employs persons of the Ku Klux Klan to be part of his security team and to work for him, such as Mr. Frank Hauser and these top Klan people. And LaRouche and I had a two-part question. Would you explain to Larry King who Fritz Kraamer is and why we never see him? Well, LaRouche said that the people who infiltrated the Klan weren't Klansmen themselves, that they were from the Central Intelligence Agency, which tells you that Lyndon LaRouche is using as part of his security members of the Central Intelligence Agency. Then he went on to say that Fritz Kraamer, the former mentor of Henry Kissinger, allegedly retired now, is, in quotes, the most protected person in the Pentagon. And he went on to say that he has influenced many of our policies. Now, as a protege of Fritz Kraamer, Henry Kissinger is still floating around, kicking a lot of ass and causing a lot of problems. A subscriber to World Watchers sent me a picture of Fritz Kraaemer that was in New Solidarity, Lyndon LaRouche's paper, August the 27th, 1981. That was 5 years ago. And it's titled, Faceless Fritz Kraaemer Found at Pentagon. Administration officials appear to be uncertain as to whether Fritz Kraaemer, the oligarchical-minded gentleman pictured here, has returned to the Pentagon from his retirement. This was in 1981 when Reagan was in power and was inaugurated January 81, and by August they believed he was back in power. The article says, from his obscure 20-year post at the Pentagon, Kraaemer made the careers of both Henry Kissinger and Alexander Haig. According to reports, Kraaemer has been occupying a post in Undersecretary Fred Ickley's office in the Defense Department for the past month. And Fred Ickley has been fighting the Star Wars prohibitions, people not wanting the Star Wars. He's defending them. And Kraaemer shares offices with Daniel Graham of the Defense Intelligence Agency, who's behind Star Wars and High Frontier. As of 1981, he was in Fred Ickley's office in the Defense Department, right at the point where his protégés are preparing to assume emergency rule by decree over the United States. And of course, in March 81, when the president was shot, Alexander Haig, his protégé, was saying, I'm in charge. And at the time of Watergate, he literally took over as head of the White House staff. The paper goes on, administration sources have referred certain inquiries on policy matters to Kraaemer at the Office for Emergency Planning at the Defense Department, which is interesting, yet a Pentagon spokesman has denied the existence of any such department. And F.D. Kraaemer is listed on the department roster attached to International Security Affairs. Kramer's son, Sven, is on the job at the National Security Council. So there is a picture of him in the Pentagon in 1981, and he has a very important position, according to this, with the Defense Department that he, quotes, came out of retirement. Now, last week on television, I caught the early news, and there was a picture of John DeLorean going to his trial in Detroit. And all of a sudden, the camera zoomed in on the question of the missing money that they're asking, where at least $12 million have gone, $12 million cash that was supposed to go into his motor car company. And for years, I've been talking about the possibility that that cash went to Klaus Barbie to pay for the cocaine that DeLorean had when he was photographed and arrested a few years ago. Well, all of a sudden, the camera zoomed in to a bank vault, allegedly, in Switzerland, and photographed box 33. And I don't recall ever seeing a camera in a Swiss bank vault, but the thing that came to my mind was that Fritz Kraaemer, Adolf Hitler's Fritz Kraaemer, was number 33 when he was released from Dachau prison. And for all purposes, no one in the world has seen him since, and I believe he jumped the ocean, came to our Defense Department, and began to run it as soon as he was released by Senator Joe McCarthy, along with Otto Skorzeny and then Klaus Barbie. These top Nazis began working for the United States immediately, and the similarity of the box number that was zoomed in for no reason at all, but as I said, I've never seen this before, and I identify with Fritz Kraaemer, number 33. There are connections between all these characters, and I don't think it was coincidental to just see a picture of that box that allegedly was the Swiss account of DeLorean. Now, some articles about Mr. Danilov, I don't want to brush them off because he's still too important. The summit's too important. But I just want to mention them quickly and go into more detail later, and some of them are self-explanatory. There's a cartoon in the paper the past week of Reagan sitting with his chief of staff who's reading him this message. It says, the Russians are still muffed because you wouldn't give up SDI. They want Danilov back. And a story from the LA Times, written by Robert C. Toth, went this way. This was just last week. An angry Reagan was the catalyst for spy ouster. The expulsion of the diplomats was a culmination of his campaign against the Soviets because of his embarrassment. The article says he was embarrassed at being forced to negotiate with Moscow for the freedom of U.S. journalist Nicholas Danilov. And he was grim over the failure of the Iceland summit that played a crucial role in his decision to expel Soviet and, quote, spies. It was Reagan who was under this according to the article, this terrible torrent of anger and frustration that he swept aside all the rules and began to cut diplomats, and they cut back and so forth. But the word here is forced to negotiate. because when Danilov was arrested, it only took 3 days for Ronald Reagan to have letters going to the Soviet Union. And as I did 2 broadcasts just on that question, he was desperate. Now, why was he forced to negotiate and then forced to go to the summit, and then he lets off his steam later? How important, again, is Danilov? And I've told you on the other broadcast, I think he's very important. But it's interesting that the LA Times, is writing out that the president was forced within days to make a deal of some kind to get Danilov out. Several other articles of interest along those lines. Soviets dispute Reagan's Iceland position. Once he was forced to go to the table, what did they say or what didn't they say? And I compared it, mentioned Stephen Sondheim's song about the Treaty House. Another article in the San Jose Mercury, October 28th. United States Soviets fuel dispute over Iceland talks. What was said? Would they eliminate nuclear weapons? Wouldn't they? And there was a request for some papers from Larry Speaks on what they really said, and he said you can't have them. October the 15th, LA Times, Speaks won't discuss off-the-record policy on the record. The White House announced yesterday that all interviews about President Reagan's Iceland meeting with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev will be on the record, but then reneged on the policy and said, you may never see these. It is a historic meeting. We won't tell you what they said. Another story by Norman Kempster, October 22nd, the scope of action of the United States baffles some analysts. And this was the process of sending certain Russians from this country, expelling them from the Soviet Union, here to here, taking away the workers there, sending more out from here. The people in the State Department and analysts were baffled. What is going on? And one person is saying that Reagan is doing it out of anger because he was forced to make the deal on Danilov. Jean Kirkpatrick wrote an article, Summit proposal surprised the Allies. Their concern is less that the sweeping agreements fell through than that some of them were considered at all. So there was something that the Soviet Union had that Ronald Reagan didn't want known about Gorbachev, and they got this meeting together quickly, and even an inner person like Jean Kirkpatrick can't figure it out. Then Henry Kissinger, of course, has a syndicated column regularly in most of the newspapers. There are a lot of them, and his is titled, Fundamental Agreements Do Not Happen Overnight. Well, they didn't get together overnight to have fundamental agreements, I'm sure. There was something they talked about. It's top secret. Nobody will know. But while they were meeting, the team, along with Henry Kissinger, like Mr. Poindexter and Vernon Walters and Richard Pipes and Richard Pearl and John Lehman and Michael Ledeen and Alexander Haig and Zbigniew Brzezinski, were all saturating the air, George Shultz and Caspar Weinberger, to make sure that they sabotaged or sent the president a message. So while he had a meeting for a few days with the head of the Soviet Union, the other team frantically was sinking the ship, whatever it was, locking up the notes, and just explaining, the anger and frustration that the president went through to even have to go through those things. And speaking of Henry Kissinger's article, you might have seen the lawsuit he placed today against Penthouse Magazine. He had an interview that he thought was with a press person he didn't think would be in Penthouse, and the attorney representing Henry Kissinger is Simon Rifkin. Rifkin was the attorney for TCI, for Otto von Bolschwing's organization, for the Galen organization, and he also representing TCI and setting up the corporate papers that covered Helene von Damm, who was secretary and translator for that group. This was the Nazi Galen operation in the United States, formed by members of the SS that worked for the OSS, and their attorney was Simon Rifkin. And staying with good fellow Nazis, he also is now representing Henry Kissinger, and like Roy Cohn and some of these other persons, Rifkin is Jewish, but that has nothing to do with their affiliation with Hitler's chief of intelligence of the East or West or the SS. They feel very comfortable working with those people and putting them into power. So Kissinger has Simon Rifkin for his attorney. The story I had about Danilov and his being mentioned in Mark Lane's book, Codename Zorro, is interesting because after I told you on the broadcast, after talking to Don Freed and Mark Lane, Mark Lane went ahead and wrote a long article for Spotlight. He's the attorney for Willis Carto, another good Nazi, titled Danilov, Spy or Journalist, with a question mark, as if he couldn't be both. Mark Lane knows that, and he probably is one himself. and it's called, titled under that, Crucial Aspect of the Story Ignored. And then he wrote a long, long article on how Danilov tried to put a wedge into the vote for the creation of the House Select Committee on Assassinations. And all of that was material that I had on my broadcast and that I had to tell Mark Lane that was in his book. Danilov's going to write a book and get a huge six-figure or more amount. In his U.S. News and World Report, there's a picture of him waving his hat. 13 days in a KGB prison. That was the October 13 issue. You'd really think that he was like these hostages that spent 1 or 2 years in prison. He's become such a hero, and he was actually locked up for a short time and then was out on his own recognizance, but 13 days was as much as he could get, and that would draw you a six-figure book or maybe $1 million. As far as a missing Israeli, Mordecai Van Nunu, who broke the story about Israel having the neutron bomb, and I don't think the atomic bomb was as explosive as having the neutron, just breaking that story 3 weeks after the Cameroon explosions. He's still missing. There isn't a sign of him. A lot of articles, Cleric, that's one of his friends, fails to find Israeli technician, and they're looking for this missing technician. I don't know if he's alive in Israel being interrogated or whether they've killed him, but this person, this scientist that worked for Israel, has been gone now for a month, and there's not a trace of him. Speaking of neutron bombs, John SINGLAUB's name is in the news, associated with the funds for the Contras, in almost every article after the first day that the plane was down. Many of you know the confrontation that President Carter had with General SINGLAUB when he was in Korea in 1977. Jimmy Carter wanted to bring SINGLAUB home, and he did. He successfully got him out of the Army because SINGLAUB criticized Carter's decision to reduce the troops that were in South Korea. That decision was reversed, and the military kept their troops. But the New York Times has a story October 8th. After being transferred to another position, General SINGLAUB criticized President Carter again, that time for deciding not to produce a neutron bomb. It was then that he was asked to resign from the military. So as soon as Carter was out and Ronald Reagan was in, we made the neutron bomb, and Reagan was sending Alexander Haig, the protege of Fritz Kraaemer, to Europe with the CIA to sell the idea of the neutron bomb. Haig worked very, very closely with the Mossad, Israeli intelligence, and as I say, the scandal over there is the Cameroon neutron bomb explosion that will eventually work its way up into the media if a few good writers or scientists get on it. So far, they're sitting on that story. I spent a good deal of World Watches this past year on the Challenger explosion that took place January 28th and did many, many broadcasts. You might have seen the articles this week. Former NASA whistleblower Richard Cook said he asked Attorney General Edwin Meese to consider a new investigation into the shuttle Challenger accident, and he wants appointed a special prosecutor, not from the White House or Meese, to conduct it. Cook is a budget analyst for the Treasury Department. He said NASA officials perceived pressure from the White House to launch January 28th because President Reagan was planning to deliver his State of the Union address that night. Now, this information I had on KGO that same evening, and it is almost a year later, and a person involved in NASA said that the White House has denied involvement, but the Rogers Commission will not get the tapes, and he's asked the Attorney General to put a special prosecutor onto the case because he believes that the White House ordered the launching knowing they didn't know that those people would be killed, but the NASA officials gave in to the White House, and the NASA officials knew that it couldn't go safely in that cold weather. And he also is accusing the Rogers Commission of hiding this work. The New York Times has a story, ex-NASA aide assails the work of the Challenger panel. Well, I said that William Rogers, the attorney, is a mafia lawyer. At the time, he was being questioned for a $40 million fine that he had to pay his law office to Jay Dominelli in San Diego. That was only the fine for having worked for somebody selling fraudulent stock. At the time, he knew it was fraudulent. William Rogers is a partner with William Casey of the CIA. So there have been quite a few articles about urging a special prosecutor and how William Rogers covered this up. And, of course, he was getting himself off some kind of prosecutions, even though he paid a deep fine. At the time, he was working on the Rogers Commission, and they never were expected to go into the story of the temperature and the White House and the pressure. Now, a very important person was arrested in Las Vegas this past week. This is the lead article of the story. Death threats led to arrest of extremist. It has to do with a former Army colonel who is one of the heads of the Posse Comitatus. He was arrested with 3 people with a California branch of their organization. They're being held without bond. They were allegedly planning to engage in paramilitary training near Fresno, California, with emphasis on night ambushes, knife fighting, and garroting. The indictment alleges the training was linked to death threats. William P. Gale, 69, was arrested last week in Mariposa, along with Fortunato Parina. The others were arrested in Las Vegas and Flagstaff. A date of December 15th is set for conspiracy, mailing a threat, communications, aiding and abetting, attempting to interfere with the IRS. And this goes into Mr. Gale's tapes. He has tape recordings and sermons. He tells you how to cut throats, how to kill blacks. He wants to cut the throats of Jews in this country. Gale, this is the Army officer, Army colonel, is a former colonel who served on General Douglas MacArthur's staff in World War II. He was considered an expert in guerrilla warfare. He served the Army until 1950. Now, I have a lot of articles on Gale, and I've done broadcasts on Gale. And as head of the Posse Comitatus, one of the most extreme right-wingers in the country, he has been arrested, and they said he calls himself the Reverend. He puts a collar around his neck, and he becomes a Reverend. And he makes these sermons and cassettes that were played in Kansas City, how to attack Jews and minorities and how to kill them. Gale was never arrested before, and it was John Hinckley, who was a member of the California Posse Comitatus, who was at my house in January 1983, and the license of the car that he had belonged to a member of the Posse Comitatus when he was floating around this state. John Hinckley, the fellow that took shots at Ronald Reagan in March of 81. It was January of 81 when Hinckley was parked in front of my house and wanted to rent a room at the house. Now, I'll go back to William Potter Gale later, because Gale not only worked with the staff of Douglas MacArthur and with Charles Willoughby, the graduate of Adolf Hitler's Kriegs Academy, but he also knew Dr. Loyal Davis in the Philippines, who had come visit there. And the family of Nancy Reagan, she took on her stepfather's name, Davis, is linked to Gale and Douglas MacArthur and the far, far right who were calling Eisenhower communist. This is the John Birch, the World Anti-Communist League, the China Lobby Group that evolved out of Japan with organized crime, war criminals from World War II and from the Philippines, the MacArthur Asian crowd, and John SINGLAUB, who's involved with wanting to push neutron bombs, among other things, who's funding the Contras, comes out of that milieu of South Korea, Vietnam, and these were the assassination teams that went on later that all worked together with the CIA, the OSS, and formed the network of people who could eliminate candidates that were in the way of their getting particular people, such as Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, into the White House. So the arrest of Gale this week is very important. Also, there's been a trial going down in Los Angeles on the 2 women who ran a nursery school, Charlotte Ruth Wyckoff, 52 years old, and Elizabeth Leda Hamilton. And they have been, they had a plea of guilty for firebombing, trying to firebomb the home of 2 other teachers. They may face a maximum sentence of 20 years or up to $375,000. I don't think they'll do that, but they brought to California Franklin Camper, the fellow who runs the mercenary school, and not separate from Reverend Gale either. These gangs all work together. Camper ran the school that trained the Sikhs that allegedly were involved with blowing up the Air India and also killing 2 people in Japan that worked with an airline going to India. The sentencing of Camper, I believe, is going to take place tomorrow, Tuesday, so by the time any of you get these tapes, you may read it in the newspaper. But Camper has been locked up in the clink along with a lot of other people, a Falk, and Mr. Falk, and a Hedgecorth, and they will get some kind of sentence, and that will keep him out of business for a while, not for the right reasons, but what he did was pretty bad, and so he's put away. As I say, the ladies have already pleaded guilty, so if they're guilty, then Camper will be guilty also, and it will temporarily slow down some of his activities. Also, the New York Times had an article, October 22nd, unauthorized genetic field tests criticized, and I'll go into advanced genetic sciences later and update you on the progress of these new technologies, the altering of genes, and there was a slap on the wrist for going ahead with the genetic field tests ahead of time. They didn't get the approval. Nation magazine finally got into the AGS question, regulating altered genes from ICE 9 to ICE minus. This is Nation magazine, October 25th, and it begins a new presidential policy directive regulating the development and release into the environment of products of biotechnology, was signed by Ronald Reagan June 18th, that greatly relaxes restrictions on what environmentalists see as an already dangerously unregulated industry, underregulated. Well, the person working in the White House for the Science Division, as I stated before, is Mr. Graham, who was in charge of NASA at the time the shuttle program was exposed for many of the faults that it has, and for ordering the Challenger to go up that terrible morning and consequently blow up. Graham moved into the White House with Ronald Reagan and then immediately linked up with a board of directors member from Harvard of Advanced Genetic Sciences, and the connections to Sweden and Belgium and the international links to this bacteria have to be developed, because a lot of people don't realize the international implications of what is happening to our lives and bodies. But this article goes on with the lawsuits of Jeremy Rifkin and the attempt to stop the altered genes being put in our environment, but Ronald Reagan gives it the go-ahead. Now, one other article I'll share with you before I get to the Nicaragua subject for the second half of this program. The London Times has a story, French panic over the Nazi files. This is October the 12th. 10 tons of files are difficult to mislay, particularly when the meticulous record, a subject as tender as the relationship between the Nazi Gestapo and French collaborators during the Nazi occupations, is involved. But all France now is agog over a claim that files have recently been found years after the war ended. Last week, Colonel Belhold, the head of the counter-espionage in France at the end of the war, poured scorn over the fact that these files have been found. The files are distressing discovery of treachery and cowardice of people who now hold respected positions in French life. And what is happening in France, the expose of people in prominence now, the files show their works with Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime during World War II, just as it's 22 years since John Kennedy was murdered, and many of the people involved, a good many of them who murdered him and who covered up the murder, are holding prominent positions and places in the State Department, in the Defense Department, in the White House, who were part of the murders and the coup that we had here, which is part of the linkage to Klaus Barbie and the Nazis of France. The International Fascista links directly to our assassinations and to the P2 in Europe and to Otto Skorzeny and Henry Kissinger and Klaus Barbie. This mesh of fascism has not ended. It was continuous, and those people who did these things moved up in power to have more power. The London Times says most of the Gestapo and the Abwehr, that's German intelligence files, were thought to have been taken to Germany and destroyed in 3 weeks after France was liberated in August of 1944. Colonel Pelol is confident that his men tracked down the residue in France on German vehicles that were abandoned in their retreat and in the Third Reich as it was defeated itself. At the end of the war, enough evidence had been gathered to charge 4,598 French men and women for espionage and treason. 56 were condemned to death. Colonel Pelol's Service-20 group worked at slackening the pace until the 1950s, and all suspected cases were supposedly dealt with by that time. Now comes the Dermarinche 10-ton bomb. There is already a clamor for the files to be made public. The French Defense Minister, André Giraud, said that the files, assuming they exist, should be transferred to his ministry for detailed examination. He has not decided whether any skeletons should be revealed. A commission, which represents the old resistance groups, will recommend to him what to do. The files would be valuable fodder for Maitre Verge, that's Jacques Verge, the attorney for Klaus Barbie, the flamboyant attorney, who will defend the Gestapo officer Barbie in a trial expected to start early next year. That's 4 years since he was arrested. Barbie was extradited from Bolivia, that's in January of 83. Now we're going on to 1987. Verge said his client could not have done his work so well without French help. He will seize on the new evidence in the files to draw attention to the French collusion with the Gestapo. So they have now found 10 tons of files of current people in French life that worked with Klaus Barbie and the Gestapo. And the London Times, October 21st, has the story, French Panic Over the Nazi Files. In this country, if we opened up our national archives, our heads of states would panic the same way because of the role of so many in the murder of the two Kennedys and Martin Luther King and a lot of other people. We'll take a 1-minute break and then go on to the Nicaraguan airplane incident, which could take every week for the next year. We wouldn't even scratch it. This is MAE Brussel, and it is the second half of a 1-hour broadcast called World Watchers, in case you picked it up in the middle of the first half hour. And I'm going to begin now what will be a long series on the Nicaraguan airplane that was downed with the one survivor, Mr. EUGENE Hasenfuss, and the reaction of our government, the statements they made, and the importance of this particular event at this time. I got a letter from a subscriber to World Watchers just recently, and he asked me, how do you approach a subject when it happens, a current subject? How do you go about collecting information to come to the conclusions you do? And being as this is really the first broadcast I'm doing on the Nicaraguan plane, and it's already been a month since it went down, maybe you can follow the way I extract the material and see how the story develops. First of all, I make a notebook for a subject. This plane's having been shot down took place or was exposed on October the 7th. It actually went down on the 5th, and we learned about it on the 7th. So I make dividers for every day of the month, say for 2 months, because many of these big stories, a lot comes out without the first 2 months, and then it unfolds more slowly later. People are anxious to get in on the early stories, and the early stories tell you quite a bit. So I take every article that I have and put it into a time slot, like October the 7th, 8th, and 9th, and then extract from it and put into charts and diagrams what I'm seeing in these articles without taking the repetition, sort of like a sieve, taking it out. And as you do that, if you're familiar with certain names and dates or places or questions, then I make notes on those and go about it that way. Now, the very moment the plane went down, and I'll share you those stories with you, the item said that there were 3 Americans that were killed on the plane, and Mr. Hasenfuss took he jumped out with his own parachute that his brother had given him, and the other 3 died. They were 3 Americans. Then within 24 hours or 48 hours, depending who was writing the story, there were 2 Americans on the airplane that were identified as the pilot and co-pilot by Mr. Hasenfuss, and a Nicaraguan that they picked up in Honduras. Now, it will be a month, this 2 days from now, since the plane went down, and there has not been an identification, as far as I know, to the 4th passenger. Now, considering the cast of characters, I thought it was very important because Mr. Hasenfuss named 2 people that I just referred to on the program last week. Then one of them was involved with the murder of Che Guevara, and Klaus Barbie also had a role in the murder of Che Guevara and hiring the CIA and helping them locate Guevara. So those linkages to Che Guevara then go on to the P2, to Licio Gelli, to Stefano Della Chaie, and the Italian Permandex operation that is so effective in killing leaders of this sort or elected leaders such as John Kennedy, or a candidate such as Robert Kennedy. So the other person named by Mr. Hasenfuss had direct links and was involved and was in jail for blowing up Air Cuba when George Bush was director of Air Cuba. And because our Congress had not allocated the $100 million, which came a few days later, it was illegal to send military supplies, and Mr. Hasenfuss said he worked for the United States government in El Salvador, the military, and he was CIA, and his wife said he was CIA. So given that cast of characters and situations, I wanted to know who the fourth person was who died, who wasn't identified, because often that is suppressed for a reason. I called our Monterey Herald Thursday, this last Thursday, and spoke to the head of the press department on the Nicaraguan story, and they said they didn't know. And they suggested that I call San Francisco and find out if they knew who this fourth person was. So I called the Associated Press. They said Associated Press in San Francisco. So I called the Associated Press in San Francisco and got no satisfaction. And they suggested I call the Associated Press in New York. So I called them, and they said they had no way of finding out. And I asked the woman I was talking to if she knew Hal Buell. He's vice president of Associated Press. And as you know, if you've listened to my broadcast quite a bit, there was this story that allegedly came out that Buell was a courier of cocaine money that Klaus Barbie had. Barbie, again, working with these people named by Hasenfuss, and that the money was deposited into Joseph Mengele's account in Switzerland, Zurich, Switzerland. And I asked this woman, do you know Hal Buell? And she said, oh, of course I know Hal Buell, and he is one of the vice presidents of Associated Press. But there was no answer there. So she suggested that I call the Associated Press in Washington, D.C., and I talked to two different people there, an Andrew Selaski and a Robert Perry, and Perry was the main person in charge of the Nicaraguan story. So he said, we don't know, we can't find out, and I told him why I wanted to know who the fourth person was, and he said, well, it's not part of a conspiracy, I can assure you. And I said, well, how can you assure me if you don't even know the name of the person? Once we know the person, we can throw it out, but how can you assure me? And he was willing to say it wasn't, that you shouldn't get too excited about these things. I called the Washington Post and talked to the news department, the persons in charge of the Nicaraguan desk in communication down there with our embassy, and they said that it was a Latino that was in the plane, and I knew that, and they said that the U.S. Embassy will not disclose the name, that the Washington Post couldn't get the name of the fourth person, that the embassy itself was holding it up. So I called the New York Times, and I asked for Jeff Girth, because he does very good work. He was out of town, and I asked for Steve Engelberg. He's another person that works along with Jeff Girth, and he acknowledged it does sound suspicious, but I don't know who he was, and I can't get the information. Now, I was trying to find out 3 weeks after the plane went down, not the day it went down. So I had an idea maybe to call the Nicaraguan embassy in Washington, D.C., and I called persons there, and they said they didn't know. A woman named Anna I spoke to, and she said the papers have said that it was a Nicaraguan killed. He hasn't been identified yet. And she suggested I call Nicaragua and to the offices of President Ortega. So she gave me 4 numbers to call. 3 of them, people who answered, didn't speak any English, and my Spanish isn't that good anymore. And I told another one, they were busy with the trial and so forth. This was Friday that I called them that I would call back this week. So Tuesday or Wednesday, I'll call back. So after that, I called Jack Anderson's office and left a message. I don't know if he'll call me or not. And I asked him who is the third pilot, not third pilot, but the third passenger who was killed. 3 were killed, and they won't name the other one, and that I'm going to do in a process of radio programs, link these people to Operation Condor and a series of articles that Jack wrote in 1984. And before I did it, maybe he could get some influence in finding out who that person was. And I also left a message with Jack Anderson's office because after I called the other numbers and started outlining these articles, I came across the name of Leon Mulcahy, an airplane that worked for the CIA that funded the Contras with weapons, illegally again, had an explosion in Texas October the 4th, one day before the other plane went down in Nicaragua. And there were 3 people on that plane that were killed, and one was from California area, San Rafael, and the other was from Sacramento, Davis area. And his name was Leon Mulcahy. He's 60 years old, and they worked for the CIA arming the Contras. Now, those of you who have listened to the broadcast for years know the story of Kevin Mulcahy. He armed Muammar Gaddafi. He worked for the CIA. He was murdered the same week that Edwin Wilson was going to go to trial, and he had a father and 2 brothers that worked for the CIA. So I left a message at Jack Anderson's office. Is the person who died the day before this other plane went down, Leon Mulcahy, related to Kevin Mulcahy? Because Kevin armed Gaddafi, and there were connections between the Nicaraguan CIA airplanes arming Gaddafi and the persons that were caught in this operation are linked to funding the Contras and working not only with the Contras in Central America, but arming Gaddafi in Libya. And the name, it seems too familiar, the age could have been right, and I wondered if there was any relationship, and of course I'm waiting to hear on that. And then I called the offices of Henry Gonzalez in Texas, because he is the lone person who's saying that the airplane that crashed out of Kelly Air Force Base on Saturday, the 4th, was a CIA plane arming the Contras, and he wants Congress to investigate this illegal activity. And I asked him the same thing. I spoke to the secretary and asked him to investigate if Leon Mulcahy was related to Kevin Mulcahy because of the similarity of the operations, and also who was the 4th person named. And then I called the Sacramento Bee because that would cover the story of the late Leon Mulcahy, who died the day before the Nicaraguan plane went down, funding the Sandinistas with military weapons were on a CIA airplane. And the reporter in charge of Nicaragua at the Sacramento Bee office was very angry. He said, "We're not going on a fishing expedition for you." And he said, "We have a reporter covering the trial of Mr. Hasenfuss in Nicaragua. She's located in Mexico City, and we don't want to give you her number because we just as soon not have you speaking to her." So really what all of the news agencies were saying is, don't bother us with that 4th person. He's just a Latino. It's like saying a black was on the plane or a Jew. Oh, that's a Jew or a black. Never mind. It doesn't have a name. It just happens to be there. And I don't believe that Mr. Hasenfuss, with his record and with the record of the pilots that he flew with, Wallace B. Sawyer or William J. Cooper, one graduating from the Air Force Academy and long records with the Central Intelligence Agency, I don't believe that the 4th person they picked up was just a nobody with no name. And as I share with you some of the current articles that came out in the first 2 days after the crash, the United States Embassy has their names and won't release them of the deceased. And it varies from an American citizen. Even though he's a Nicaraguan, we have anti-Castro Cubans who are American citizens and people from all over the world. And there's a lot of discrepancies about the matter. The foreign minister, Alejandro Bendano from Nicaragua, was saying, he said, the dead men were U.S. citizens, and they're now dying in our country, and Mr. Reagan can escalate the war. The dead men were U.S. citizens, so they know in some way that they're U.S. citizens, but again, finding out who this 4th person is something that I will keep pursuing because I believe it's very, very important. Now, to get the articles, starting with October the 7th, which seems 1,000 light years away, I want to just share the highlights of those early articles and certain points about them for this particular broadcast. I don't have to give you the newspaper dates, or some I can if you want. As I say, the 7th and then on to the 8th. The Monterey Herald had Contra plane victims may be Americans. That was the first story. A man who survived the downing of the Contra rebel plane identified himself as a U.S. military advisor in El Salvador. 3 of the crewmen who are dead were Americans. This was the first account. Now, there's a lot of discrepancies in the trial. EUGENE Hasenfuss has changed his mind that they weren't associated with the CIA. Now, the CIA is a whipping boy that is used over and over again. That's a figure of speech that has nothing to do with the way people work or think. There is the Defense Intelligence Agency. There's just the plain Department of Defense. There is the National Security Council. There is the Defense Industry Security Command. Those are 4 agencies that can change the whole history of America, and they don't have to be part of the CIA. Fletcher Prouty has a very, very important article this month in Freedom Magazine on the distinction between the CIA and the Defense Department, that the CIA can start many little operations, but the laws are there that the Defense Department can take it over. So none of the people involved with Hasenfuss have to be CIA. None of the airplanes have to be CIA. They can be former CIA, like James McCord and E. Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis at the time of Watergate, who were in fact CIA, but who worked for the Defense Department in the National Emergency Security, which Fritz Kraamer allegedly is working with now and is a part of. So To throw around the agency is to lose the point that they do, in fact, have links up to the White House, to the National Security Agency, to the Vice President, who happened to be a CIA director, but they can change their label every week. It doesn't matter. The point is that they're part of the government. But getting back to, again, the first story, it said the 3 crewmen were Americans. Washington Major Eugene Thornton from the Pentagon, the spokeswoman, says she had no report on the plane incident, no identification of any individuals. This was the first day. The Houston Post said Nicaraguans say Americans were shot down. Now later it's going to switch that the third person that was killed was a Nicaraguan. I think the Nicaraguans would know the difference between an American and Nicaraguan, and I don't know why it's cloudy. The article says the Pentagon spokeswoman doubts Managua's claims that the survivor is a U.S. military advisor. I don't believe he's one of ours, the Pentagon said. The State Department refused to comment. The Marine Guards at the U.S. Embassy in Managua refused to comment. A Soviet ground-air missile shot down a camouflage plane at 12:45 p.m. on Sunday. It was a C-123 that violated national airspace 18 miles north of San Carlos near Costa Rica, 91 miles from Managua, southwest. The troops recovered 50,000 AK rifle cartridges, PG-7 grenades, dozens of rifles, and boots. You may have read about those. Another story from the Houston Post, cargo plane on mission for CIA, says lawmaker. This is, again, the 7th. All these are October the 7th coming out, each one having a different story. Now, this is the account of the CIA plane, according to Henry Gonzalez, which is different than the Nicaraguan, but it came out the same day. Civilian cargo plane crashed at the Air Force Base in Texas over the weekend at Kelly Air Force Base. They were picking up explosive material destined for Contra rebels in Nicaragua. Representative Henry Gonzalez from Texas said the mission was for the Central Intelligence Agency. Such aid is not authorized yet. It's used in advance for the money they were going to get by that $100 million that was passed. It was a CIA plane contracted and owned by the company in Florida. The company that is owned is the Transamerica. It's leased and operated to Southern Air Transport, which is a CIA plane. It goes on to say that the 24,841 pounds of cargo on board included 20 rocket motors, 14 rocket catapults for seats. It was en route to Warren Robins Air Force Base in Macon, Georgia. Victims were pilot Peter Samet, 52, of San Rafael, California, Philip DeCrenzo of Stowe, Ohio, 31, and flight engineer Leon Mulcahy, 60, of Sacramento. And that is the Mulcahy that the Sacramento Bee would not say one word about. They wouldn't help me, as I say, on a fishing expedition. Now, the next day, the articles ran like this, the headlines. John SINGLAUB and CIA deny involvement with the plane. The plane that was shot down was operated by a private group, led by retired Army Major General John SINGLAUB. It took off from El Salvador. It picked up a Nicaraguan in Honduras. It flew off the coast of Nicaragua, turned inland to deliver the ammunitions. 2 Americans died, Wallace Sawyer and Bill Cooper. The State Department and the CIA Defense Department denied the flight was any way connected to the United States government. Now, John SINGLAUB is linked to the plane, but there's no link to the government, and yet I will share with you next week, probably by next week. Many of you might have seen it or read it over and over again. The meeting of Ronald Reagan in the White House with Lieutenant Colonel North from the National Security Council and George Bush deciding that when Congress said that the Contras couldn't have more than 28 or 27 million of humanitarian aid, that they would bypass the law and make their own private army and go ahead and arm the Contras militarily anyway. And these are the people that got caught. SINGLAUB is a retired general working with the National Security Council. So one's the defense, one is the national security, and George Bush, former director of the CIA and the President of the United States. The article goes on, Sally Hasenfuss called the State Department. She said her husband worked for the CIA. He worked in Vietnam for Air America, a CIA-owned corporation. Interestingly enough, they checked at Camp Pendleton, and I'll get to that again a little further along. They had no record of him working in the Army at all, and he says he was overseas in Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, and the paperwork says that he's non-existent in terms of working for the military. So it was a straight contract, I guess, for the CIA with a different kind of paper to it, but Hasenfuss, even though he was overseas, was not part of our Defense Department. It goes on, John SINGLAUB is head of the United States Council for World Freedom, formed in 1981, and SINGLAUB, the man who wanted Carter to have the neutron bomb, who wanted more troops in South Korea, formed his organization in 1981 when Ronald Reagan became president, because then, if Congress didn't give them everything they wanted, and he was working with the anti-Castro Cubans and the Somozans that were kicked out when Somoza left Nicaragua in 1980, they could head their own private army with the likes of SINGLAUB and the Defense Department and do the things they were doing when they got caught a few times over, but again last week. The article goes on, SINGLAUB, who formed his U.S. Council for World Freedom, allegedly had already raised $10 million privately for military supplies to insurgents and Contras. Now, Secretary of State George Shultz the next day said, it was, for all we know, a plane hired by private people, apparently some of them Americans. They had no connection with the United States government at all. And I want to share these individual statements that you might have read and build up a case of how many times people in our government lie over and over and just come out with these press conferences and statements, and there isn't a shred of truth in any single thing they say. Then this article continues, congressional committees, chairman, vice chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee were assured by the CIA that there was no American government role in the incident. Now, they come out with this kind of a denial saturating all the news media when it is common knowledge that General SINGLAUB sat with Lieutenant Colonel North and the President and the FBI arranging their own little private wars. The San Francisco Examiner, October the 8th, has a story. Downed Contra plane linked to retired U.S. Army general. And it goes on to tell about SINGLAUB group operating cargo planes laden with guns and boots, and how Mr. Hasenfuss was able to get out in a parachute. The other three died, but his brother gave him a parachute that he used, which is interesting. I don't know if the others wore parachutes, but he conveniently got out and made a hammock in a cottage where he slept, and the troops found him later. He had survived and made, as I say, a sleeping place with his parachute. And this was one not issued by the government. And maybe the other ones were to bite the cyanide pill or whatever if they went down. But his brother, with a little bit of noxy, didn't trust the federal government. And his brother William gave him his own parachute, and that's how Hasenfuss landed. Marie Calero, the head of the operations for NDF, which is the Nicaraguan Democratic Force, the main Nicaraguan group which the White House wants to work with, but which are closely related to the Somozan army, so that causes conflicts. He said this had not anything to do with Jack SINGLAUB. He wasn't involved in any way. The plane was piloted simply by U.S. mercenaries and was financed by a foreign government friendly to us. And there have been articles that followed asking, how is it if Congress says no, then someone like SINGLAUB and George Bush says to Israel or Saudi Arabia, give us the money because those fools in Washington who bother so hard to get elected and don't have a brain in their cell don't know what they want, so you give us the money so Saudi Arabia and the Vatican and the Knights of Malta can send what made up the $100 million that Congress wouldn't give them. So the denial comes from the head of the Contra operations. That's how much you can trust him. And then they continued, the fourth person was of a Latin origin, not identified. Well, they made a point of saying that over and over, but it's, as I say, 1 month later, and he's still Latin origin from Nicaragua, not identified. And it goes on, Hasenfuss had a card issued July 28th from the Salvadoran Air Force, and he had access to restricted areas at the Air Force Base in El Salvador. Southern Air Transport flew supplies to the Contras. The company knew nothing about Hasenfuss or the flight. And that turned out to be a lie. Later, you read in a day or two that Southern Air Transport had everything to do, and they employed the two pilots, Wallace Sawyer and Bill Cooper, and it had everything to do. But the very first day, they're out there denying it. They said that company knew nothing about Hasenfuss. The People's World had an article, October the 8th, captured U.S. flyer to face the press in Nicaragua, and they hoped that the world would learn about the 15,000 people that the Contras have murdered in the last 5 years, and that these operations are run from the White House itself. And it takes a newspaper like the People's World to just come out and say that the White House runs it. The evidence is there, but very few people have the nerve to say it. The San Jose Mercury had a story, the 8th. The third crew member killed apparently was a Nicaraguan, but he was not identified. And we're still back, again, worrying who this one was. And as I say, this was a month ago that the other men were identified, and John SINGLAUB's relationship to these people was identified. And yet the bodies of the Americans are being sent home. They were shot down and sent home. And the third victim, again, has not been identified, and his body has not been released. This was October the 10th. The body was not released. October the 8th, New York Times. Despite American denials, the Nicaraguan officials charged that the plane was operated by the CIA. The U.S. Embassy said there's no American military advisor there called Hasenfuss. They said that they wanted to see the prisoner, and they wanted to view the 3 crew members that reportedly killed. This is on October the 8th. The American Embassy went to view the 3 crew members. It can't be that people as sophisticated and educated as the pilots of this plane and Mr. Hasenfuss, who's worked for the CIA for 20 years, going back to flights in Southeast Asia, he wouldn't know there's only 4 on the plane and they don't know the name of the 4th person. Well, if it was a Nicaraguan, they would identify him. The embassy went to see the body, but they still have not given the name. A story in the New York Times, October the 8th, outspoken general raises money for the Contras, and then they begin to say how he does in fact raise money, that he has a private institution, that he uses all kinds of money to help him. And the New York Times has a story, private venture and plane were down, U.S. disavows role. And they continue to say that it was a right-wing group led by SINGLAUB. So at first it wasn't SINGLAUB, he didn't know about it. And then finally the articles in the New York Times said SINGLAUB is affiliated with the World Anti-Communist League, of which he's current chairman. Now they leave out the fact that he's also on the board of Western Goals with Edward Teller of Star Wars and the hydrogen bomb, and with John Reese, the notorious John Reese, and a lot of other interesting characters from the Defense Department, such as Admiral Moore, a close affiliate of Henry Kissinger, and a person who was stealing papers from Richard Nixon's office for Yeoman Redford at the time of Watergate. The New York Times story on October the 8th said SINGLAUB was on duty in a covert unit. He specialized in terrorist and guerrilla operations. Well, now, Colonel Gale also, he specialized in terrorist operations and guerrilla operations. And that Gale, who was picked up just this past week and arrested, this terrible racist anti-Semite, worked in conjunction with people like John SINGLAUB, a racist anti-Semite with the World Anti-Communist League, and they got their training in guerrilla action, particularly in the Pacific, and then brought it back not only to Central America and around the world, or killing people all over the world, but then brought it into the United States, where Gale is doing his terrorist activity and guerrilla operations, and John SINGLAUB set up the magazine Soldier of Fortune, where mercenaries and murderers can meet each other, and they're doing murders in the United States based upon introductions that they made through these magazines, through their experience in Vietnam and South Korea, and working in the Philippines and with Japanese mafia and organized crime, and so forth. The foreign minister from Nicaragua said the facts are that a plane was shot down. It had an American crew. It was a United States plane. It was obviously the CIA. It's a technicality what agency they work for. Now, one of the interesting things is an account that the weapons on this plane were Soviet weapons. This is another trick we do as agent provocateurs. We supply them with Soviet weapons so that there's a cache found or a cache of weapons. We can say, oh, look, the Russians supplied them if they take a village. Now, this happened notoriously in Grenada, where persons responsible for going through the warehouse of Maurice Bishop were Michael Ledeen and Robert Brown, the man who runs Soldier of Fortune, working in conjunction with John SINGLAUB. The Washington Post, October the 8th, has this story by Julia Preston. The Nicaraguan Defense Ministry said yesterday that Soviet weapons and ammunition had been recovered from the wreckage. It was meant to resupply the anti-Sandinista rebels and the Contras. So what you get is an airplane filled with Soviet weapons the kind that Samuel Cummings could put in, the arms supplier for all over the world. His offices are in Virginia and in London, and he supplies Soviet weapons, and then they could be left in villages where people are killed and say, well, we came in and they were shooting us with Soviet weapons. So one of the big shocking things is the agent provocateur type of activity, because these people were in charge of the Grenada papers of Maurice Bishop's desk. Michael Ledeen is tied directly into the National Security Council, to Francesca Pazienza and the P2, to Licio Gelli. He was working in Grenada, which was a sample invasion to get ready for Nicaragua, along with Robert Brown, the protege of SINGLAUB, and telling us how the Soviet Union poured so many weapons into Nicaragua. We have to save them from the Russians taking over. And yet the Washington Post and other articles that develop say that the plane was loaded with Soviet weapons and ammunition, and again, they could massacre people and leave them around. The Washington Post also continued, the third man picked up in Honduras was a Nicaraguan. And this goes on for, as you read your articles now, it's the same story. In San Salvador, the U.S. Consul said they had no personnel missing, that Hasefus, even though he said he worked for them, was under pressure from the Nicaraguan interrogators, and they speculate he was forced to say that. Well, I'm running out of time now. I'm just leading into Nicaragua. I'll continue next week. But they were delivering Soviet weapons so that Reagan would have a chance to pour even more money in. They were denying it from the State Department, the Defense Department, from the El Salvadorian Embassy, from Washington, from George Shultz, all of them taking a story that they knew they were involved in and lying to the American people. The subject of information and disinformation is key now because of Mr. Admiral Poindexter of National Security saying that it's all right to give disinformation for other people or us if it's part of a war. And if they want to run the Contra war or have this deniability, they will continue to deny it. I'll continue updating some of the important news stories next week and then do a half hour more on Nicaragua, because as the story develops, it gets into murders, drug dealing, and as I say, the International Condor, the unit that worked in Spain at the time of the Spanish Civil War, the fascists, right up to the present crew of the plane and the people they work with now. So we'll do that next week and keep up with the other stories at the same time, I hope. In the meantime, this is MAE Brussell, and I'll be back with you next week to continue along these lines.